Hey everybody, this is Mr. Moppin coming at you with another APUSH video. We're taking a look once again at topic 8.13, the environment and the modern environmental movements. Now, last time we talked about many of the concerns of environmentalists in terms of reducing the number of species in existence, oil spills, radiation emissions, chemical fires. All sorts of things that are going to be, very, very potentially damaging to the environment, and the activism that will be done to try to affect change. And, that includes, of course, like you saw with many other interest groups, the idea of, or many other movements, the forming of interest groups, lobbying, protests, bringing media awareness to the issue, and it will start to pay off. As we get into the 1970s, more and more governments are starting to, make protecting the environment a priority, and probably no state more than any other in terms of, being on the vanguard, being on the forefront of trying to create environmentally friendly legislation will be California. And it really has been for like the last 50 years, basically. No state has, tougher emission standards on cars or polluting emissions from factories, etc., than the state of California. Now, this is one of the beauties of federalism here in the United States. The idea that, yes, you have a national government that is responsible for certain things, but you also have at the same time 50 state governments that also have their own responsibilities. And a lot of these responsibilities between the national and state governments are shared, or what you would call concurrent powers. And, the idea being is that, if one state like California, takes the lead on trying new legislation, new policy to address an issue, in this case environmentalism, and it works, well, then that will serve as, kind of a test case for other states to replicate, if not the federal government to replicate. Now, speaking of the federal government, the 1970s will be a very, very important time for creating policies that are going to be environmentally friendly, starting with the creation of the EPA. The EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency, and you can kind of see that this has now become a priority, that we now have a federal agency dedicated to just issues that involve protecting the environment. And basically what this does is serve to enforce any kind of legislation that's been passed into law dealing with the environment. So the EPA is going to be a very significant, federal bureaucratic agency. And yes, there's going to be plenty of things for them to do. At the same time that we see the EPA be created, we see the passage of the Clean Air Act, which is going to create, federal guidelines for reduced polluting emissions into the air. 7 years later, you'll see the passage of the Clean Water Act, which is going to create federal regulations to reduce the amount of pollutants released into the water. We also see the creation in 1973 of the Endangered Species Act, basically, putting federal protections on animals that are nearing extinction. One of the important examples of this will be the American buffalo and the American eagle, two symbols of America that were nearly destroyed, but now have been able to come back. Especially the buffalo. The buffalo came back in such plentiful numbers that buffalo are not even on the endangered species list anymore. Now, keep in mind also that we've talked previously about the challenges that Americans had to face in the 1970s during the energy crisis from OPEC's embargo of oil to the United States. And yes, you're going to see gas prices go up significantly. And yeah, you're going to have to drive slower per federal regulations. But from an environmentalist perspective, not that they support, the actions of a cartel, and, they're not, environmentalists are not supporting, OPEC holding America hostage, so to speak, with regards to access to oil. But environmentalists are going to be able to say, though, that, hey, take a look at what things we are doing that's actually environmentally friendly as a result of the energy crisis. The idea being is that if you now have reduced speed limits to 55, you are actually having cars operate at a more fuel efficient speed. If cars go really fast, they go really slow, they're not as fuel efficient. Closer to 55, they are most fuel efficient, which means that you can get further on less gas. And of course, less oil means, better for the environment. And yes, you're going to have cars that are going to become, especially designed to be more fuel efficient. Smaller cars, a lot of cars that are now going to be imported from Japan, they're going to be meeting these needs. And note, the federal government is going to start to create, fuel efficiency standards for American automobiles, and many state governments have done so as well. So the idea being is that nobody really looks at the energy crisis as an inherently good thing, but environmentalists are going to use that negative to, try to, in essence, make lemonade from lemons, and basically try to say, hey, look at some of the steps that we can take now to, reduce oil consumption, which by definition is better for the environment. We also, of course, are going to be seeing, a growing, as I mentioned last time, as a result of not just Cold War fears of nuclear war, but fears of, potential nuclear meltdowns, like what you saw at 3 Mile Island in 1979. You're going to start to see a growing anti-nuclear movement that is going to be playing a role. And we already talked about previously that above-ground nuclear testing will end in the early 1960s. And as we get into the 80s with, especially when there was a real fear in the early parts of the Reagan administration that, we were going to be, maybe engaging in nuclear conflict as Reagan is building up the military, we do see as we get to the end of the 80s and the early 90s, we see the U.S. sign off on agreements with the Soviet Union to significantly reduce nuclear weapons around the globe. Now, granted, there are still tens of thousands of nuclear weapons around the planet, but far fewer than there used to be. Now, one might look at all of these aspects of government policy that's designed to help protect the environment as solely a positive thing. But, conservatives, are going to have some problems with some of these issues. And, some of these, policies are going to get blunted a little bit as we start to get in the 1980s with the, the conservative revolution of Ronald Reagan. And, the key thing about conservatives is that, conservatives do not hate the environment. Conservatives, of course, care about, protecting the earth. But the question becomes, though, how far do you go in the name of protecting the planet, with the consequence being hurting business, hurting profitability? Conservatives will argue that the EPA's regulations that you have to follow as a business owner are too cumbersome. There's way too much red tape, too much bureaucratic paperwork, that the regulations cut in on the profitability for many businesses. It delays, the production of, infrastructure projects like bridges and highways and things like that. And some would argue that, hey, you could build a factory at a certain location that might hire, 500 people, but the EPA might prevent the construction of it because it might lead to some sort of beetle going extinct or something like that. So, conservatives will argue that, yes, protecting the environment's good, but, at what cost? Is it worth putting, people out of work? Is it worth, cutting into profits for American business owners and things like that? So the EPA is more of a controversial topic even today than you might think. However, a lot of these policies were put in place, the Clean Air Act, the creation of the EPA, the Endangered Species Act, all those things were put in place during a Republican administration, Richard Nixon. So, interesting stuff. Anyhow, we will leave it here regarding the environmental movement. We'll see you next time.